that we have studied the elements of art and the principles of design and looked at those closely, we're going to go to a different type of art analysis this time, and that is by studying art through what it was made out of. We're going to categorize art into media. So for this first chapter, chapter 6, we are covering the type of art, drawing. And you may just think, oh, pencil is drawing. And that is true, but you will find through this chapter there are many types of media that actually are considered drawing. And so we're going to go through dry media and liquid media, as you see there on your screen. And dry would include graphite, metal point, charcoal, crayon, pastel, and chalk. And then liquid media would include pen and ink, brush, and ink. So what you're going to see with this chapter, you'll notice right away, this is very different than the previous chapters. This is going to be showing you one individual media type, so we'll start with graphite. You'll see pictures of all the different types of graphite tools that we have, and then an example of each one, an example of graphite. And so what you'll want to make sure you get in your notes is what it is, what generally the dry media is, and describe it. Then you'll want to make sure you get a reference to each work of art. So you'll want to put, again, like we've been doing, title, artist, date if you have it, just to make a reference. And then describe what you see in that picture so you can remember what it is or sketch it out, or both. And then we want to make sure we understand what category of dry media or liquid media that work of art falls into. And in the broad category of drawing. Everything today is considered drawing that I show you. That we just categorize it down by what specific material was used. So let's dive into drawing. So drawing materials are very basically a pigment, like a colorant, plus a binder. And binders are the substance that allows it to be shaped. So pigment, again, is just what color the material is. And pigments are things that have been discovered and used since the cave paintings that we looked at long ago in chapter 1. They can be made from natural things found just in nature, like minerals, iron oxides, things like that. They can be made from plants. And now, in modern times, we have synthetic pigments that are made to create the colors that we want. There's also natural materials that have to go through a processing to get to the color that they want. And so there are just many, many different types of pigment, but it's all the same thing. It's a colorant. It's what's coloring it. And this is the same thing that would be in paint, and I've mentioned that before, I think, in lecture. It's not just drawing or painting that you have pigment. The ground, first the binder, a substance that allows it to be shaped. So there's different types of binders. Basically the thing that holds the pigment together. Pigment, as we use it in art, is usually a powder. It's been crushed down and refined, and it's pure as they can get it. And it's a crushed powder, very fine powder. So you have to have some way to create a stick or a thing that you can actually hold with your hand to mark with it. So that's where the binder comes in. And that can be a variety of things, from wax to what's called rabbit skin glue, or different like resins that they use. And it's just, they can use them in very small amounts, but it's just like churned together, like you mix a batter or something together, but it's very dry, and then it's compressed oftentimes to create that drawing tool. Now there's variations on that, and you'll see as we go through this, drawing materials aren't always made that way. There are some that they just pull right out of the ground and can use it, graphite being one of them. It can just be dug out and used, shaped and then used. Chalk is another one that can just be taken straight from the earth. So ground is a preliminary coating of paint that's applied to a surface. Oftentimes with drawing materials, if you think about it, even with a pencil, it's a solid substance, graphite, in your pencil lead, and you are causing it to make a mark on a surface. So it's leaving behind itself as it makes a mark, right? That's what the mark is. Many of the materials we'll talk about today have to have some sort of coating put down first on the paper or canvas or whatever you're writing on to make that drawing material, the media itself, whether it's graphite or metal point or pastel, it has to cause it to leave itself as you make the mark, if that makes sense. Leaving a little bit of it behind as you scrape it across the surface, and that's what makes the line. Different media require different grounds, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go through, but you just oftentimes have to have that in order to make it leave its mark behind. There are some reasons to study, or reasons to draw, and make sure you write these down because these are kind of more about the purpose behind it. Much of what we talk about today is just going to be looking at and studying the actual material that the artist has used. But this talks about reasons to draw, or why artists do drawing. And this is kind of a big deal. Why do people draw? Why do artists draw? In older times, the artist would typically draw as a way to do pre-drawings for a finished piece. And you see that listed there, finished piece. So they would do little studies, little sketches in the planning stages of what they were going to do for a painting. Because back in older times, historically, drawings just done with pencil or chalk or something like that were not considered finished works of art. They were just considered like kind of a lower level of the artwork. So they typically would just do that as a process of practice. Maybe go out in nature and study things, and that's listed there too. Study of nature or imagination. We'll look at a work of art by Leonardo da Vinci, and he was really known for that, just having many sketchbooks, practice drawings, where he would study nature. He wanted to understand what he was looking at before he felt like he could paint it or accurately render things. So that is another reason artists will draw. And then another is just imagination. They just want to create. You may be a person that sits and doodles. Maybe you're a person who enjoys drawing like fantasy pictures of other worlds or things that aren't real. And so that's a reason that artists like to draw. And then, as I said, there are preliminary studies. But there are works of art, many now, and even older ones that we'll look at a few, where they were finished works of art. They were completely drawn out drawings with much detail and intended to be finished works of art. So those are kind of the reasons that artists did studies, or do drawings, I should say. So what do we draw on? We draw on paper, typically. Not always, but a lot of times. And paper is the main one. It originated as papyrus, made from plant fibers. The plant fibers are beaten into a pulp, mixed with water, then spread in a thin layer over a fine mesh and left to dry. I don't know if you can picture that process in your mind, but that is what paper is. Even today, modern paper that we have is essentially the same idea. It's just made in a much more manufactured, thin way. True papyrus would have been pretty thick, pretty dense material. Not anything like the modern paper that we have today that you can almost see through when you hold it up to the light. And other drawing materials used, the word supports that you see there, that's the word we use to describe what you are drawing on. So as we've studied, cave walls is one for sure, but also silk, often in Eastern cultures, would be used as something to draw on, and fired clay. That was discovered more in ancient times, where they found that if you carved into dried clay or into wet clay and then let it dry and let it be fired either in the sun or in some sort of a kiln, they have a very durable, long-lasting support that's not going to decay. Hence why we can find those things now and see artifacts from that time period of ancient civilizations that wrote into clay. A lot of the important information we can learn about cultures historically was either some sort of writing system that was carved into clay, but also drawings. Okay, so we're going to start with our first dry media. When you talk of drawing, we had to have this slide of what you're drawing on. There has to be something that you're drawing on. Our first dry media is graphite. As the slide says, dry media is usually applied in a stick form. Not always, and as we go through these pictures of the actual art tools, you'll see that there are sometimes they're applied in liquid form with a brush, but oftentimes dry media is in some sort of a stick form. So what is graphite? It's a soft crystalline carbon. Again, it's a naturally occurring substance, but we combine with clay and encase in wood to make it a pencil, like you're familiar with. The more clay that is added to the actual graphite, the lighter the marks will be. It's basically like thinning it down, putting a filler in there. The clay is kind of like a filler. And so they mix it with clay in different amounts, and the less clay, the darker the graphite mark will be. The more clay, the lighter the graphite will be. So on each of these slides, I have this image of the different types of drawing media we have, and I'll just try to point to them as I go through, I think. So here in the center, we have mineral graphite. That is what it would look like if it were naturally mined from the ground. And here we have a range of pencils. All of these are like modern pencils that, as that described at the top, the graphite has been combined with clay and now it's encased in a wooden stick. These are all different types of modern pencils. We have a variety of erasers that artists like to use. Graphite is one material that is easily erased, so it's a good choice for that reason. Some of the other ones we'll look at today are not so easy to erase. This thing here is called a stump, and many of the different media we look at today will have a stump in their list of things as well. Stumps are just a tool that can blend, that you can sometimes use your finger to blend graphite, but it's cleaner and looks a little better usually, and you don't get so much oil from your finger into your drawing if you'll just use this stump. It's basically just paper that's been rolled around and around and around, and you just keep unwrapping it, and you can just kind of rub it, and it will blend the graphite. Smear it, blend it, make it fade so you can show some tonal ranges when you're working in graphite. These are all erasers here. And then we have, these are various types of, oh no, I'm incorrect. These are more stumps over here. This one is a stump, and this one is a stump, and this one is a stump. A knife right here is a common, more, an artist who's kind of a real natural person. They'll just take their knife and carve down their graphite stick to make it sharper, because you have to be able to get sharp, right? To do details. And then these all of these things right through here are various types of, we call them porte crowns, which are holders. So you can put the graphite into the holder and make a mark. As you can see, some of them, like this one right here, is like a very skinny little metal stick, and it just has basically a long skinny piece of graphite stuck in it. So there's just different types. This one's the same way. It's a thicker barrel, but it's got just a little piece of graphite right here, a graphite stick that they slide into it. So it's kind of taking the place of the wood on a pencil. And back to these modern pencils right here, drawing artist pencils, you can get a whole set like that. Oftentimes they'll come in a set ranging from hard to soft. The softer, again, is the one that has less clay, and so when you make a mark with it, more of the darker graphite is going to come off on the paper. And then that way artists can kind of use a whole range of tones as they're creating their work of art. Okay, so let's look at an example of graphite. This is Chris Ofili's Prince Among Thieves with Flowers. This has been done all with pencil, and it's hard to see up close what's going on, but the entire border there is made up of circles that then he shaded to create them almost they look like beads going around the contour line. This would be an example of a contour line drawing, though it's not done with just a simple line. It's dots that create the contour of this prince. But each little dot has been done in a way that makes it appear to be three-dimensional. It has like a shadow and a highlight, so they look like beads. Those were done with probably a softer lead graphite so that it comes off nice and dark, where the flowers in the distance, the flowers in the background, although in this one you can see the flowers are also in the figure. So they're in the thing that's being drawn, the figure. They're also in the ground, the negative space around it. We'd all agree he's the positive space. But they're very faint and pale, and so yes, you can apply less pressure to a pencil and get a lighter tone, but most likely, and he was in fact using a wide variety of those soft and hard leads to get that very faint light effect of the flowers in the background. So that's an example of an artist using the full range of lead. Okay, the next media type is metal point. You probably have not heard of this one or maybe aren't familiar with it. It looks similar to graphite. When you look at a drawing that's done with metal point, you may not be amazed by it. It's a lost art in that not many people do it today. It was definitely more of a Renaissance time period media. Though it is done today, and it's considered a highly skilled type of drawing. What you have is a thin silver wire set in a holder. One difference or change, I would say, though, from that definition is that it's not always silver. It could be tin or different types of metal. Gold, in fact, or less valuable metals can be used. Any type of metal, really. That's why it's not called silver point. That is a term that is sometimes used, but it's not always silver. So we call it more of a general description as metal point. It could be different metals. So it's in a holder, and when it's used on specially prepared ground, meaning the surface that you're working on, it leaves behind a trail of metal particles, and those actually tarnish as time goes by. If you're using pure silver, then the tarnishing effect is more reliable. But other types of metals can be used and they may tarnish in different ways. But all the same principle. The reason this isn't quite as done as frequently today is it does require a lot of skill and it is time consuming. When you create something with metal point, which I will show you an example in a second, it's not like you're shading like with a pencil where you press harder and you get a darker tone. You don't get any change in when you make a mark, the mark always looks the same value. It does not change in darkness. The way to create it darker looking is to put many marks and actually layer them up. And then that will create the effect of it being darker. If you want it lighter, you have to spread them apart. So it's almost more like using pen than graphite or a pencil. So let's look at what we see in this image. We have a roller here. The roller is used to apply a ground to the paper that you're going to use. Remember, a ground, as I said on the first slide, is a preliminary coating of paint applied to the surface. Now, it's not always paint. There has to sometimes be different calcium carbonate or different types of materials in the ground that's going to work for the material we're using. This one has to have almost like it almost has to get to like a chalky type feel when you apply the ground to your paper, because you want that metal to like scrape and leave a trail of its metal behind. So it's a very specific ground that has to be applied. It's kind of confusing as I talk about this because we talk about the ground being applied, which these are the papers that have been prepared. We say that's the ground, and ground has been applied. So it's kind of confusing. It's all lumped together a little bit. The paper is the ground, and then also the stuff that's being put on there, the paint that you see on there, is what we also call the ground. And then, not to add another layer of confusion, when we're talking about figure ground, right? We talk about figure being the subject of the painting or picture, and the background is the ground. So we really use the word ground a lot in art. It kind of gets intertwined or used in different ways. So what we have are the roller here. These are the metal point styluses right here. You can see they're little holders basically, and they hold a very thin piece of metal, very skinny, almost like a wire. It looks almost like a wire that's in the end of it. And then these are mixed and unmixed grounds, because this, I should turn it. This one would be like an unmixed ground. The ground is going to have a little bit of pigment to create a color. It's going to have a little bit of gum in it, which is like a binder that holds all the stuff together. And then it's going to have a little bit of that calcium carbonate in it that's going to create the texture that it needs to make the metal mark on the ground. The ground on the ground. So this is what it looks like when it's just the thick paste that's that mixture of different things. And then this is what it looks like once they've thinned it down, and I believe just with water, and they make like a thin, really thin paint that then is painted onto these papers right here. So that's how the process of preparing the ground for metal point goes. It's very specific. And here's an example of what metal point can look like. This is Filippo Lippi, and these are just figure studies. So this is an example of what I was talking about, where this would not have been displayed as a final work of art anywhere. This was just an artist's studies of something. So where we look at this and we're like, wow, that's really good, and they obviously put a lot of time and effort into this, and they're using metal point, which is not easy. It was really just studies that he did, though. This was definitely not a finished work of art that was intended to be like sold or displayed in some way. So you can see where I believe the way they did this is wherever you see the darker tones, so like here where you see a little bit of darker, or here there's a dark place here. Remember, it's not about pressing harder with the tool. Like with pencil, we just press harder and it gets darker. Here it just has to be skillfully several lines made, little hatch marks. Remember that term from a previous chapter? Hatching or cross-hatching the lines close together and they build up more and more, and then it appears dark. And then after time goes by, it's going to look different because that metal tarnishes or changes as it sets, and it gets oxidized in the air. These places here where are really white, like he brings out the highlight there, I believe he has gone back and added some white chalk on top of that. I believe that's right, to create those highlights. But the cool thing about Metal Point, the thing that's appealing to artists, and looking at this flat drawing or this piece of example of this on your screen is definitely not doing it justice. If you were to look at this in real life, it would have like an iridescent, metallic, silvery look to it. So it's just a very rich way to create a drawing, much more sophisticated and beautiful, really, than a graphite drawing would be. So we cannot appreciate the full effect of what Metal Point looks like just by looking at these slides. Seeing one in person would be much more interesting and appealing, I'm sure. Okay, our next type of media for drawing, dry media, is charcoal. Charcoal is what it sounds like. Charred wood. And there are several varieties of it. You can have vine charcoal and compressed charcoal. It's a very popular drawing tool, used in art schools, done a lot of times for like gesture drawing or sketching, because you can do it fast and it's kind of loose. It's typically not as much of a detail media. You cannot get those tiny, tiny, fine, intricate details like I just showed you with the Metal Point or with graphite. But it's a little more loose material. And it's a messy material too. So let's look at some of these things. What we have here is powder charcoal. So this is charcoal that's been ground up and it's in a powder form. You can mix water with it and create washes. But oftentimes when it's powder like this, artists will just use it and blend it and smooth it using a stump. So let's look at some of these materials. Anyway, we have, as I said, powder charcoal here and here. Those are powder charcoal. We have a chamois cloth right here. This can be leather, and it will be something that you kind of wrap around your finger as you're working, especially with that powder. You can blend it and smear it together. You have erasers. Charcoal erases easily, and these types of erasers, a lot of times we use gum erasers where you can it just pulls it back off. And this gray one is a kneaded eraser where it just pulls it off. It doesn't really rub the paper too much, because if you rub the paper, that charcoal can get ground down into your paper and then it's just going to look gray. So the kneaded eraser is more of a lifting off of the charcoal. These are called stumps, as we've talked about, and there's a variety of types of stumps there. These, interestingly, are called willow twigs. This shows you willow twigs that have not been turned into charcoal, and these are willow twigs that have been charcoal. They basically heat willow sticks to a really high temperature and don't allow any oxygen in, and it just turns into charcoal, goes through a chemical change and becomes these charcoal sticks. We also use, actually this one is probably vine charcoal, and this one would be willow charcoal. Vine is just what it sounds like, vines that you find in nature that have been heated very hot and turned into charcoal sticks. And then this thing is a charcoal crown, which is mixed with it's charcoal mixed with some sort of binder that is making it more dense, less charcoal-like, and it's compressed very tightly into a more compact stick. So you don't get as much, when you make a mark with that, you don't get as much left behind as you can think about what you know about charcoal from a charcoal grill, it's kind of a crumbly, messy substance, and then when you make a mark, it leaves lots of crumbs and little bits of debris behind as it makes its mark. But with these compressed charcoal crayons, it isn't quite as messy, but you also don't get quite as rich and dark of a color that comes off, because anytime you add a binder to something, it sort of thins it down just a bit. It makes it like an additive has been added to it. These willow ones and vine ones, it's very bold black when you make a mark. So we'll look at an example of a charcoal drawing. This one, Yvonne Jacquet, 3 Mile Island, Night 1. She did a study of this nuclear reactor on 3 Mile Island, and as you can see, where it's white, that's where the paper has been purposely left to be not as many marks on. But look how dark and rich and just this truly high contrast, to use a word from an earlier lecture. Contrast is a difference between dark and light. So she's using value, an element of art, creating contrast, strong variety differences between light and dark. She's also using value from a light source. If you look at like this right here, you can see how there's a lighted side and then the shadow on it. So things are looking three-dimensional. She's creating the illusion of three-dimensional space. Where you see the really bright white, like right here and right here, chances are she used one of those eraser tools I was talking about, like the kneaded eraser, and just kind of pulled that charcoal back off of there. Because when you're doing a drawing like this, it's easy to get charcoal smudges everywhere. And so if she wants it to be like a clean, bright white area, she probably had to pull some of that back off. But you can just see how dark and extremely dark you can get with charcoal. It's a nice black, really. Okay, the next medium we're talking about is crayon. Crayon and pastel we put together like this. Really, let's think of this slide as more about pastels. Crayons is kind of a side medium off of pastel. Both are made with powdered pigment. So the color that you see is the result of whatever pigment they use, just like I've been talking about, made from minerals, made from plant materials, things usually in nature, some now made synthetically. And both are mixed with some sort of binder. Remember, the binder is the thing that's going to hold it into the stick shape that it's in. So if you can just picture a big vat of powder, a red pigment powder, they throw in a little bit of some sort of material like it could be wax in the case of a crayon, or with pastel it's going to be more of a gum resin that they mix in with a little bit of kaolin is another material they put in it, and they just smush it all together, knead it up, almost like in a mixing, like your home mixer might have. And then once it's all churned up and evenly distributed, then they roll it into these rolls, compress it really tight, and there you go. You have a stick that you can hold of color. So the big difference between pastel and crayon is crayons have a waxy binder, and pastels don't have it's not greasy or waxy. It's more of just we call it gum. And it's just a thing that really makes it stick together. Sometimes sap is used, but it's not waxy. Now, crayons, like Crayola crayons, like you used as a child, is a form of this, specifically crayon, like you see. The reason you get like cheap crayons that don't work very good, I always got the cheap crayons as a kid, and I always wanted the big super mega box of crayons, the good Crayola crayons. Cheaper crayons that are that simply don't work as good is because, again, they have more wax in them. They have more of that binder, which is like a filler, and less pigment. So when you make a mark, you're seeing more wax and not as much pigment come off on your paper. The higher the quality, the more pigment. And so children's crayons, like Crayola ones, are pretty good quality, but then you can bump up to a higher level of quality, like a oil pastel, if you've ever heard of those. Oil pastels are commonly used like for children in public school art classes, and they are just like a very nice crayon. They have more pigment and less binder, less waxy binder, which makes them they're softer. So when you make a mark on paper, a lot of the material comes off and you see very rich, bright color. So it's kind of confusing because we call those oil pastels. It's like we're mixing the two things together. So oil pastel almost is like in between crayons and pastels, because true pastels are mixed with that non-greasy binder, and they're not waxy, they're not oily when you mark with them. So these are some examples. We have this box of pastel sticks. It's kind of confusing because I have their pastel sticks and crayons, so it's like still calling it one thing, but and in fact maybe in this picture they are calling, these may be a picture of oil pastels. I'm not sure. There's oil pastels and then there's just pastels. And like I mentioned to you, oil pastels are, they have the wax in them and they're really soft. Regular pastels are almost more chalky feeling. So really old style pastels are not waxy, but these apparently are a waxy pastel stick. Kind of confusing. And then these are modern pastel pencils. So they just have that material compressed into them and made into a pencil with a wooden covering. Knife is something an artist would have on hand again because they can cut that down. Either the actual stick, you can sharpen it if you need to, or if you're using a pencil like this. Here's the drawing stumps. There's always stumps, right? That's used for blending and mixing colors. And notice I haven't said this before. They always have a tip, don't they? That way you can blend tiny little details or get into small crevices if you need to. Sponges, and these are sponges right here, and these are powder pastels. These are used for blending or smearing the pastels once you make a mark. There's just different shapes of them, different sizes of those sponges, so you can get into details. And then the powder pastels is more like, it's kind of cakey, but you can actually make it come off on your paper, like almost like the charcoal powder. And then you can use the sponges to blend it. So it's the same material, it just really probably would have less binder in it, so it's a looser, and then you can blend it loosely that way, almost like a loose powder. So the big thing here is with this media, you've got color, don't you? The other ones we've talked about so far were pretty much just grays, black, more tonal, and now we're introducing some color. So these pastels kind of blur the line between drawing and painting, and when I show you the example, you'll see what I mean. This is by Degas, the Singer in Green, and this is the time period called Impressionism. And you might look at this and say, well, that's a painting, right? It looks like a painting. But it's done using these stick forms of pastels, which is really just pigment in a binder, and you're making marks with it. So it's really technically in the drawing category. However, the end result, as you see, actually looks more like a painting. You might have thought that was a painting. But if you look at the background here, you can really see the marks that he's making. So where it looks more blended and painterly, where my cursor is here, that's probably been some of that sponge work has been done, some more blending sticks perhaps, Where back here, it's not really finished. It's more just like loose marks made with the pastels. And if you look closely, like even in here, some of this detail here, or the edge of her dress right here, or in the background too, even in here in her hair, you can see it almost makes me think of how a child's artwork looks when they color with crayons. The texture of the paper is still there. It doesn't come off just solid like with paint. So that does give you a clue as to what this is made out of. And that's our example of pastel. Our next media is chalk. All of these things you probably have some idea about. Like we know there were children's crayons. That's the idea of a pastel or a crayon. You know pencils, so that's the idea of a pencil. Metal point, you probably hadn't really seen that or maybe heard of that before. Chalk is a very naturally occurring material, and it's what you know, chalk, from like school, where somebody writes on a chalkboard with chalk. It's a very simple medium, very natural medium, but used very skillfully to create fine works of art, and has been used for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's a soft, finely textured stone composed of a variety of natural materials. And so let's look at some of the things we see in this image. We have lumps of red chalk. The red is because of iron ore that is in the naturally occurring chalk stone. It's a very porous stone, so it's, as you know, you've probably felt chalk before. It's feels like it has air in it, right? It's not a tightly compressed stone. It's very porous. And that's what makes it useful for drawing, because when you make a mark with it, some of the material of itself is left behind. But that's why you get red, is because of the iron that's in it. Interestingly, these are breadcrumbs. Breadcrumbs are used by chalk artists to actually erase. They absorb the chalk and kind of pull it back off the paper. Chalk is an art material that does not erase super easily. It gets ground into the paper that you're marking on, and it doesn't erase very well. This is also a kneaded eraser, like I told you before. Kneaded erasers, they're called kneaded, K-N, because, not N-E-E-D. They're kneaded like dough, because you can erase with it, like it pulls it off. It's more of a pressing the eraser onto the paper and then lifting it off, and it pulls whatever media that you made a mark with back off. Then that material is on the eraser, and so if you just take your fingers and knead it up and squish it around, then that works the kneaded eraser almost absorbs that dry media that you erased, and you can use it again. Eventually, the kneaded eraser will get totally full of charcoal or graphite or whatever you're trying to erase, and you have to throw it away and get another one, because it's like it absorbs it, and then it ends up just being a black lump of something. So you have to get a new one. Side note on kneaded erasers. And then here you have your stumps again. Almost all artists use stumps to do some blending and detail work. These are your Porte crayons for holders. Don't be confused there. When I say crayons, it's not the thing that's making the mark. The crayon means it's something that makes it portable. You can put it in there and use it as a tool. So it's the actual holder. You can see that this example has the chalk in the Porte crayons. This is the chalk in it. There's a black one on this end and a red one on this end. So that person has two colors to choose from. These are fabricated chalks. They take the naturally occurring material of chalk, but they compress it again with another binder and make it into more of a dense stick. We call those Conte crayons, C-O-N-T-E, with a hyphen, crayons. And Those are frequently used in art school for sketching, drawing, learning about how to render something, but they are they're just not as natural and loose as these. Very similar to the talk we just did on charcoal. You can have the loose, naturally occurring charcoal that comes off in big chunks, and same thing with chalk. You can have very grainy, loose, porous chalk that when you make a mark, a lot of the material comes off, and then you can have these more compressed, manufactured ones that are not quite as, still get the effect of a nice, bold, rich color, but they're compressed into a tight stick that's not so messy, actually. Then we have white chalk, just like very familiar with that, I'm sure. Very, sidewalk chalk, school board chalk, same type of thing. This is a red chalk wash where water has been added to the ground up chalk. So this would be like taking this chalk, grinding it up, adding water to it, and then you can paint it on in what we call a wash, where it's kind of like a thin, almost looks like watercolor layer of chalk. And then black chalk. So the three main colors are red, white, and black for chalk, as you see. And here's our example. This is, I don't have a title on this one, and that's fine if you don't know. This is just to show you a visual of what it might look like. First of all, do you see that the paper is very textury that this artist drew on? The artist happens to be Michelangelo. That gives it some what we call tooth, so that when you make a mark with it, with the chalk, it really grabs onto the pigment. It's very similar, if you've ever done any painting of a house, it's very similar to the idea that you have to put a primer down first. If you don't put a primer down that has some tooth to it, some texture to it, then when you paint on top of that, it won't stick. It'll just slide off. Well, that's kind of how lots of these art materials are. That's really what a ground is. Primer is a ground, in fact. I should have said that a long time ago. Primer is a type of ground, which when we get to paint, we will talk about primer. But for the dry media, for drawing materials, you still have to have a primer to create a ground. So anyway, you can see here with the chalk, it's just done in a very tonal way. This is very blended and just kind of a dark patch. The harder you press, the darker it's going to get. Where out here, there's purposely very light areas, and also that may have been pulled back off with the kneaded eraser to get those highlights in there. And then here you can see some line work. It's really, you can do a lot of technique with chalk. You can do more sketching and linear line work, or you can do more blending tonal work. All right, next we have switching gears from dry media in this drawing chapter to liquid media. And that's really what it sounds like. Even though in some of the dry media, like chalk and, I forgot the other one, there was you can make a liquid version of it. I'm looking back. Really, it was just the ground that we talked about, liquid for the ground for the, this one, metal point. That's not the actual metal point, though. That's just preparing the ground. So that's where you would add water to it. But the technique itself doesn't have any water involved. Then I talked about, that was really it. Then there was just the charcoal, or the chalk, chalk. You can make a version of it mixed with water. The chalk will stay suspended in the water, so you can actually paint with it. But this is a whole different thing. Liquid media is usually applied with a tool. So in this case, the liquid is what the material is. So like pen and ink, it consists of very fine particles suspended in water. A binder like gum arabic, which is often the binder, holds the particles in suspension and helps adhere them to the drawing surface. A pen with a nib attached is used to draw on the surface. So I'll show you a picture in just a second of what a nib looks like. But you need to make sure you know that. Get this definition of pen and ink down. And just know that with pen and ink, you have to use a pen with a nib attached, and then that's what you dip into the ink, the jar of ink, and that's what you draw on the surface. So I'll show you clearly what that is in just a second. So brush and ink is another way to apply it. You can either hold the stick of a pen with the ink in the nib, or you can have a brush and dip it into the ink and just paint with it, basically. Brush and ink consists of very fine particles suspended in water, same material, it's the ink. And then a binder like gum arabic holds the particles in suspension and helps adhere them to the drawing surface. And so then you see the only difference is brushes are used to apply the ink in a wash of value to the drawing surface. So wash, I've just said briefly now. When we talk about watercolor, we'll talk more about what a wash is, but it's just what it sounds like. It's liquid with some, it's going to be water liquid with some pigment in it of some sort. And the more pigment, the darker the wash. The less pigment, the lighter the wash, because it's got less color in it. And then you basically brush large areas with this wash. Is typically how a wash is done. They're not going to be like dark black. It's going to be like a thin wash of something. Okay, so what do these tools look like? Here are some pen and ink tools. What we have here are quill pens, very old-fashioned actual feathers, and they would cut those to a fine tip like that. If you look right here how they specially cut those, there's like a little, they're hollow is why this works, and then the way you cut it at an angle like this, when you dip that into the ink kind of goes up into the tube just a little and clings to the sides of the tube, and then it just sort of is running down the tip, so that when you start to write with this or draw with this, just a fine line of ink comes off the tip. So those are two examples of quills. I'm sure you've seen old movies and things where people are writing with a feather, with a quill. Then we have lots of inks up here. You can see these are ink jars, very old ink. So those are inks, black inks. And then over here we have colored inks, because you can have colored ink. Ink is very permanent. It definitely stains if you're using it. Here we have, as you can probably recognize, Sharpies. Sharpies are modern felt tip pens. Same idea, you're making a line with ink, right? You're holding a tool and making a line with ink. And then we have brushes. So these would be used for that brush and ink technique, where you actually just take the brush and you dip it into the ink jar and you spread it out in a wash. And then we have these are the pins that I was talking about, and they have these little nibs stuck in the end. So this is a nib. Those are 3 different types and styles and sizes of nibs. And these are a modern way to do pen and ink. You can just buy those pin holders and buy the nibs, replacement nibs. They're just made in a special way that when you dip it into the ink, kind of like the quill, the ink kind of goes up into the pin. It's just like it sticks to the sides of it and goes up into it just a little bit, into the nib. And then as you write, it just kind of slowly comes out the tip. And then these are reed pens. A lot of Eastern art uses that. A lot of Chinese art is done writing with these reeds. They're also hollow. That's the whole key, is they have to be hollow, so that the ink will kind of sit up into the tube a bit, and then it comes down the tip, or it pulls it up. In this larger one, the ink wouldn't go up into it, it just kind of cups into the shape of it right there. It's something about it being hollow, it pulls it up into it, just the shape of it being concave. Same thing with the quills. It pulls it up into it, and with the nibs, they are a concave shape. So the ink gets pulled up into the side of that curve just a bit. And then as you press on the tip, all of these, same idea, the ink comes out in a thin line. So here is an example of artwork done in ink. This is Rembrandt van Rijn, which is probably, you know him as just Rembrandt, one of the most famous, and in this case it says greatest draftsman who ever lived. He was just super skilled in being able to draw using the pen technique, detail, and he did countless drawings using pen and ink. So we call that a draftsman, someone that drafts when you use pen and ink. This is called Cottage Among Trees, just one little sketch that he did. This isn't one of his finest works or best known works, but it does show using lots of hatching, cross hatching. See how the roof is really dark? That's because he's done lines one way and then lines the other way. And this is all would be done through that, using either a quill or a nib on a pen to create those pen lines, the ink lines. And then here is another example of using ink, a liquid media of ink. But this one is from 1990, and it shows really these bold, thick, bold black lines of these two men fighting. And the technique here is pen and brush, or excuse me, ink and brush. So the brush has just been dipped into ink and then made lines. Look at how it's harder to control that. Like, it's kind of harder to create, or maybe it's just his style too, but it's kind of looser. It's you're just going to get these thicker, bolder lines and marks. All of these, I told you they're considered a wash when you paint it on that way. And it is a wash, but yet this artist has chosen to make it very dark and solid. So you don't see a lot of lighter washes. These would be very dark washes. Like this whole section here is just basically black. So they've used the ink very thick. Here you can see it's thinner. So it's thinned out a little bit. I don't know if this artist mixed any water with their ink or if they just used straight ink. But again, the more water you add, the lighter the wash. And then our final dry media, actually in the category of drawing, is collage. Now this might seem a little bit not drawing-like, but it is definitely dry media, and we do put this into the category of drawing. Collage is a French word that means pasting or gluing. It refers to the technique of attaching actual objects to a support. So instead of making a mark with a tool, you are actually gluing on things to a support. And so it's kind of a outlier of the drawing media. It's not really fitting into the drawing media totally, but this is still where we categorize it, at least for the purposes of this course. And this technique was pioneered by Pablo Picasso, in case you have heard of his name before. And the example that I'm going to show you is a really cool artist, Romare Bearden. And he did a lot of collage work using images from magazines and newspaper articles and pictures that were from newspaper clippings, and then would piece all of these together to create scenes. And the scenes, a lot of times in Bearden's work, show like just kind of images and allude to his growing up in African American culture in rural North Carolina. So he puts a lot of traditions in there. He kind of alludes to quilting. Oftentimes in his work, you'll see a train in some point, and he had made the quote, "A train was always something that could take you away and could also bring you to where you were." Um, and in the little towns, it's the black people who live near the trains, is a quote by Romare Bearden. So he's making a lot of references on his experiences of African American culture. And so that is our last image for the chapter on drawing. I hope you can see we encompassed a very wide range of media, everything from collage, which is really on the outside border of that, to pastel and ink and just plain old graphite pencil. So drawing is, really like that inherent thing that we talked about earlier with humans, how we draw in the sand with a stick, or we write in the steamy glass, we make images. And so it's really, it's just really kind of a inherent quality that we as humans have. And I hope you see how it is very rich in the art world and how it has developed tremendously through time, but it's always used. It's always a way to essentially just express visually what an artist wants to get out, whether it's a finished piece of artwork or just a sketch for your own personal use. Drawing is a very important type of artwork. So next time we will be doing lecture on painting, is chapter 7, and then after paint, chapter 7 comes chapter 8, which will be, I'm just looking real fast, printmaking, which is an interesting art form. And I'm thinking chapter 8 is 6, 7, 8. I think then we'll have a test after that. So we go over these major medias, and then we'll do some other ones after that. We'll talk about architecture, sculpture, things like that. So I hope you've enjoyed today's lecture, and we'll see you next time.